Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the ranking of King. I got behind a little bit, but I am still reading, and our Dark Tower book club is going very well. We are on Wolves of the Kala right now. But I owe reviews and rankings for The Wastelands and Wizard and Glass. So here we are with The Wastelands, Dark Tower Book 3. So the Dark Tower has always reminded me of a theme park, like Disneyland. In the center of this theme park, you have the Dark Tower, much like Cinderella's castle. Extending like spokes off of the tower are different lands, each influenced by some kind of genre or other world. And the beams of the tower, which we learn about a little bit in this book, are like the paths to the tower, as well as acting kind of like borders that separate one world from the other. This becomes readily apparent in the Wastelands, as our quartet, our group, is finally together, and they travel from like a weird science fiction world with a giant robot bear into a frontier town, through a haunted house, and then on to some bizarre, corrupted version of Tomorrowland. In this book, we also learn about the 12 portals of the tower, the guardians of the beams. The lore of the Dark Tower really starts to take shape in this novel. And it is interesting how it's not until book 3 of a 7-book series that we really start to get the understanding of this fantasy quest, of this world. King takes a much different approach to world building from different fantasy authors. We are learning about the world as the quest is progressing. I also think that this is the novel in which King really starts to drive home the main theme. And for me, that is the importance of fiction and how fiction shapes the lives of those who create it, and of those who read it, and even the characters within. It is here that we see that the elements of our world, the real world of you and I, the readers, the world of Stephen King, all of these things have influenced Roland's world and maybe are also influenced by Roland's world. You know, of course, we've seen bits and pieces of that before with like the Beatles song Hey Jude and other small things, but here it becomes like really evident. We are introduced to a being called Shardik, a giant robot bear who is a guardian of the tower, of one of the beams. We are introduced to a city called Lud. Susanna mentions another book. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. There's a mention of a ZZ Top, perhaps a World War II flying ace. It's as if the fabric of space and time in the world of the fiction and in our real world, the key world as King starts to call it, is like the fabric between these dimensions and reality is rubbing thin, much like the thinnies that our characters face. Now, one thing I started doing around the time that I first read this book is I started to, when an author that I like, when he or she mentions another author or a book in their fiction, I pay very special close attention to that. And in this book, we are introduced to Shardik by Richard Adams. So of course, Richard Adams was the author of Watership Down, and I was familiar with Watership Down. I read that as a kid, but I never thought to pursue Richard Adams as an author. Well, when King mentioned Shardik, I found an old copy of Shardik at the thrift store and I read it and I really liked it. And I had since lost my copy, so I recently bought a new copy of Shardik. I think this is a pretty fantastic novel and I highly recommend it. We are also, Susanna mentions a novel that I forgot about and I had never heard of. And I recently bought that. I have not read it yet, but I am looking forward to it. And that is The Bridge of San Luis Rey by Thornton Wilder. This sounds like a really fascinating book, and it's quite well known. I'm not sure why I never heard of it. Another failing of American public schools, probably. But this says, can be called a novel that firmly established Thornton Wilder in his prominent spot in American literature. This exquisite work, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Wilder in 1928, embodies writing of a very special sort. The gentle philosophy is woven from the story of the 5 who fell from the bridge 200 years ago in Peru. It is handled with such meticulous care and construction that the novel is still regarded as a model in contemporary letters. The faith of another era, another world, lives for today's reader. So I bought this old copy, and I am really looking forward to reading it. I think it sounds absolutely fascinating. And then, of course, we are introduced to Lud. And I believe that King got the name for Lud from this old fantasy novel called Lud in the Mist, written by Hope Mirrlees. This series by Golans, this fantasy masterworks, and they have the science fiction masterworks series, are really fantastic. They came out in the early 2000s, and when they came out, they were kind of like the Ballantine adult fantasy series from the 60s and 70s, edited by Lynn Carter. This series reintroduced a whole new generation to all kinds of old classic works of fantasy and science fiction that had been long out of print. The one thing that is quite different between the two series is the covers for most of these fantasy masterworks are terrible. I don't know why they didn't do this like really prestige cover art like the old Ballantine adult fantasy novels did. But we still got to finally be able to find these old books that were highly praised. And this is a pretty good fantasy. It doesn't really have anything to do with the Lud in the Wastelands novel, but I believe that the work was inspired King. So my 2 favorite parts of this novel are the stuff with Jake in New York at the bookshop and the Rose. I absolutely love everything to do with the Rose in the Dark Tower series. I love the stuff in book 6 with the Rose and the Tet Corporation. And here it is introduced, and we start to learn about the cosmic qualities of the Rose and its relationship to the tower. Everything with Jake in New York is so exciting. The way that he and Roland are both experiencing this like very literal existential crisis on a major scale. And I love his passing into Roland's world. I also like the very end of the novel with Blaine when our group is finally together. The introduction of Oi, the Billy Bumbler, Jake's little like fantasy dog. I love him. But when they are all together, passing through rivers, crossing on their way to Lud, there's just a lot of really well-written moments in this book. I do struggle a little bit this time with the very beginning of the novel. I just didn't find it as exciting as I used to. I wasn't as engaged until we were with Jake in New York. But yeah, that cliffhanger ending with Blaine, the mono, Blaine the Pain, is just, it's infuriating. I couldn't imagine having read this while it was coming out and having to wait for Wizard and Glass. Luckily for me, of course, I read them all in one stretch because I waited until this series was done to start. But yeah, so that is The Wastelands. Now, I did want to talk about one other thing. In this book and in the books that follow, we start to see that King is drawing together his creations as well as other sources of fiction and nonfiction and literature and music and art. And I think it's important to really think about the artists who worked on The Wastelands. In the first book, we had Michael Whalen. And in this book, we have Ned Dameron. And Ned Dameron and Michael Whalen are 2 of my favorite fantasy artists. And just as it is important to King how he was referencing other works of fiction as well as his own fiction in The Dark Tower, and that becomes super important to the story of the Dark Tower, so too does the artist. Book 7, the artist is incredibly important to the story. And so I did want to take a quick look at, I recently got this copy of A. Merritt's The Face in the Abyss with art by Ned Dameron. And some of the art in here is really, really well done. And you will, if you've seen his art in The Wastelands, you will recognize his style. It's very otherworldly, and it's quite good. This is an absolutely beautiful book put out by Donald M. Grant Publications, which published The Dark Tower in their first editions. But just I mean, that is like straight out of The Wastelands. So cool. Ned Dameron is just a fantastic artist. If you're not familiar with his work, I highly recommend becoming familiar with it. And then also we had Michael Whalen, who did the art in book 1 and book 7. And Michael Whalen is actually the artist of my favorite versions of the Elric series, and that is the Daw first editions. I've got copies of all of his covers, and I absolutely love. These are like, for me, these are kind of like the absolute best fantasy covers of all time. Absolutely love them. But it is important to think about the importance of the art in the book, especially when we come to book 7. So here we have our placard, The Wastelands, there with a picture of Blaine the Mono speeding along the monorail. Now, when I first read this series, The Wastelands was my favorite. But over the course of a few years and rereading it, it has dropped quite a bit. I can't exactly say why. I think I just am not as excited about it as I am the other books. I don't get as much out of it beyond the plot as I do some of the other works in the Dark Tower. And in reading it close to, things like Pet Sematary and It, I really can't place it above those. I like the Darkslinger more than those. I love the drawing of the 3, of course, more than those. I mean, those are just that's just a masterpiece of a novel. So this is going to be the first of the Dark Tower books actually not at the top. So our ratings so far, we have the drawing of the 3, the Gunslinger, Pet Sematary, It, The Mist, Desperation, Skeleton Crew, Cycle of the Werewolf, Tommyknockers, Firestarter, and Needful Things. Cycle of the Werewolf, another artistic connection. You have the art by Bernie Wrightson in there, and then Bernie Wrightson does the art for Wolves of the Kala. All right, so I'm actually going to place The Wastelands is going to be right below It. And so that's where It is residing, below It. So our new rankings as of now, drawing of the 3, the Gunslinger, Pet Sematary, It, The Wastelands, The Mist, Desperation, Skeleton Crew, Cycle of the Werewolf, Tommyknockers, Firestarter, and Needful Things. Sorry guys, well I hope you enjoyed this look at The Wastelands, and we will talk to you later. Bye bye.